thank the City of Miramar for inviting me during this wonderful celebration. And hopefully the remarks that I make will help enlighten and bring some clear understanding about Black history, which is actually American history. One goes hand in hand with the other. And I've been asked to come and speak about the role of Black music in Black history. Black music and Black history are very closely intertwined. For every period in the timeline of Black history, there's a mood and a music that helps to tell our story. For every level of struggle, there's a soundtrack of outpouring that has given faith and has allowed for survival. Black music has grown, just as Black people have grown. So during Black History Month, let us all, Black and white, briefly explore the origins of Black music and the Black experience. Let's start off by saying that in terms of origin, drum beat was the heartbeat of the African tribe, and it helped to pound out a lineage of kings and queens. The drum beat was the background of many a ceremony commemorating the rites of passage of the people. Ceremonies that celebrated love, life, and religion, from hunting to farming to jumping the broom to naming a baby. Drum beat is the basis of Black music as we know it. And in African tribal culture, music was ingrained and inherited, not so much as a hobby, but as a trait. When Africans arrived in America, they brought a culture that differed from that of their European captors. Music was central to daily life, and dance was integral to its performance. Slaves spent much of their leisure time singing and dancing to the accompaniment of drums, xylophones, calabashes, horns, banjos, musical bowls, tambourines, triangles, and jawbones, played in a distinctly African style. In the 1740s, as a result of slave revolts, many colonies began passing legislation that prohibited the playing of African drums, horns, and other loud instruments. Over time, traditional African instruments disappeared and were replaced with modified versions such as the banjo, derived from the banjar, guitar, derived from the banza, diddly bow, washboard, washtub, jawbone, spoons, which were substitute for drums and rattles. And the slaves also adopted European instruments, including the violin, the mandolin, and fife and drum, which became popular among African Americans after the Civil War. These were all played in an African-derived style. Since the earliest days of slavery, singing was accompanied all kinds of group and individual work activities of African Americans. These improvised songs, known as work songs, field calls, also field hollers, and street calls, also street cries, served at many functions. They lifted spirits, coordinated the movement of workers, and offered encouragement. They also communicated human emotions and provided a forum for criticizing whites in positions of authority. As Africans in America, slaves retained many traditions of the past, which remains relevant after the abolition of slavery. While working long hours in the cotton and tobacco fields or clearing brush, husking and grinding corn, cutting wood, rowing boats, laying railroad tracks, and as stevedores and fishermen, they sang work songs, pass the time, relieve boredom, and coordinate movements of repetitive manual labor. Many work crews had song leaders who improvised a line to which the others responded with a refrain. Other work songs consisted of repeated choruses. Work songs are commonly associated with groups, but individuals who worked alone in the fields or at a distance from others sang field calls, known as field hollers, as a personal form of communication. These conveyed the needs of workers for water or food, as well as a range of feelings: sadness, loneliness, joy. Crew leaders also used calls to give work instructions. Street vendors in towns and cities used street calls, also known as street cries, to describe and sell products such as watermelons, peaches, apples, ice cream, etc. As both slaves and free people, African Americans frequently expressed their displeasure of poor working conditions, unreasonable expectations of employers, and inhumane treatment from those in authority. So we have the situation during the period of slavery, which started in the 1600s and lasted up through the Civil War, of three distinct types of music: the field or work songs, syncopated music created by African instruments for dance when the slaves celebrated, and when the period came that African slaves were being converted to Christianity, they evolved the Negro spiritual. These three distinct forms of music laid the groundwork for what was to come as the cultural sea change in America. The bedrock of most American music, and as you look at the Grammys on Sunday, you see what it has evolved to. Basis of the original American music all began in those days of Negro or Black American slavery. Let's talk for a moment about the folk spiritual, or the Negro spiritual as it was called. One of the most exhilarating, expressive, and inspiring forms of African American music, beloved by all people of all religious persuasions despite its exclusive lyrical adherence to the tenets of Christian belief. Storytelling is gospel, whose predecessor was the folk spiritual. The earliest form of African American religious music, the folk spiritual, also known as Negro spiritual, the form of improvised music spontaneously created by individuals and groups. Folk spiritual draws from African music and European songs and hymns, and from African American secular sources, including work songs, which we talked about, field calls, and protest songs. Folk spiritual originated in the late 18th century among Southern slaves following their conversion to Christianity. Conversion, however, did not result in slaves adopting the traditions associated with the practice of Christianity. Instead, they interpreted them in ways that had meaning to them as Africans in America. Slaves often sang the spirituals in groups as they worked in the plantation fields. Folk spirituals, unlike much white gospel, were often spirited. Slaves added dancing, later known as the shout, and other forms of bodily movements to the singing. They also changed the melodies and rhythms of psalms and hymns, sped up the tempo. Added refrains, repeated refrains and choruses, and replaced texts with new ones that often combined English and African words and phrases. The final product was an improvised African-style song. Initially passed down orally, folk spirituals have been central in the lives of African Americans for over 3 centuries, serving religious, cultural, social, and political historical functions. Early folk spiritual melded the Christian belief system with native African culture, and from it created something uniquely American. By engaging in the singing of a spiritual, the participants tasted freedom. Folk spiritual later evolved into the civil rights songs of the 1960s. At this point, I'd like to change the discussion over to probably the most seminal moment in terms of the development of American music, as well as the history of America as a nation, and that is the Civil War. The Civil War started in 1861, and as we just discussed, there were several distinctive types of African and African-American music being practiced within the slave culture. However, the Civil War, which was the most cataclysmic event in American history, killing more American citizens than any war prior to or after combined. And the one thing about the Civil War in terms of the African American was that had it not been for African American soldiers entering the war, there probably would not be a United States of America. In 1862, when the North was taking a pretty brutal beating from the Southern troops, they hadn't won not one battle. And the African slaves who were fleeing the plantation in droves, along with the Africans who were already located in the North, were trying to enter the war as soldiers for the North. They were prohibited. It was called strictly a white man's war, and they were not allowed to participate in the Civil War. However, because the North was being beaten pretty badly by the Southern troops, because, quite frankly, the Southern troops had more passion about what they were fighting for. They were fighting for a way of life. They wanted to continue the institution of slavery. And they didn't want to be controlled by the North. The North didn't necessarily want to abolish slavery. That was not their mission. The mission of the North was to preserve the Union. And that's what the North was fighting the war for, to keep the United States together. Because the president at the time, Abraham Lincoln, felt that a divided house will fall. So those were the reasons that the South fought, and that was the reason why the North fought. Well, apparently, the South felt more passionate about why it was fighting the war and was carrying the day. The Emancipation Proclamation was then brought to the table and signed by the President and the Congress to allow, not necessarily to free the slaves, but to allow the slaves to join the battle and become participants in the Union Army as soldiers. Up to that point, they were banned from being actively engaged in the Civil War. Approximately 500,000 African Americans joined the Union forces after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and as a result, the North carried the day, and in 2 more years, the war was over, and the North was victorious, and the Union was preserved. So here we have a situation where we want to go back to music. How did that situation transform the culture of the American landscape? Very simply put, by joining the military and having over 500,000 soldiers, you had black regiments that had marching bands. They learned and they were trained to play instruments. After the war, these men who were involved in the marching bands went back to their communities, migrated to other places, and formed bands called the syncopated brass band. But what they did was they took their style and applied them to the new instruments, the brass instruments along with drums. And here you have the beginnings of what is considered the new American music. Very beginnings of jazz, beginnings of the blues. All of these styles of music, these early forms of black music, were an outgrowth of the bands that evolved out of the Civil War, and the musicians that were trained to play these instruments that went back to their communities and migrated to other communities. So this ingredient that was an outgrowth of the Civil War did much to catapult the sound of African American music and develop it to a level that is at today. We have gone through many transformations, from early rural blues to New Orleans style jazz. Some of those marching bands began in New Orleans because of the cultural mix, develop a distinct style of music. It is said that the birth of jazz began in New Orleans, but it was not only New Orleans, but many other small towns and cities that began to develop a sound and a style as a result of being trained in Civil War to play instruments and further evolve the music of the time. So we have a situation where we have the spirituals that evolved into gospel. We have syncopated dance music that then became syncopated brass bands that then evolved into jazz. And we had the field of work songs that evolved into blues. And the blues evolved into rhythm and blues. And the blues evolved into soul music. And soul music was the music that became the signature sound of the civil rights movement in the United States. Soul probably had more influence on a critical time in our history, being the civil rights movement, than any music of any other type, in terms of what it did to inspire and move forward and motivate the actions of a people, change the landscape, and bring freedom to the African American and to the American community as a whole. Now let's talk about soul. Soul is a gospel-influenced African American popular music style that evolved out of rhythm and blues in urban areas beginning in the late 1950s. Its passionate vocalizing, powerful rhythms, and honest lyrics spoke directly to a generation of young African Americans. And soul music became synonymous with the social and political developments affecting them. Soul became popular as a distinctive style during the 1960s and peaked in popularity in the mid-1970s. Its rise paralleled that of the civil rights movement. Thus, soul acted as a soundtrack for the ascension of Black pride during these years. The music can't be separated from the prevailing mood at the time, and vice versa. Soul sound began to take shape during the era of the modern civil rights movement. Pioneers Ray Charles, Sam Cooke, and James Brown tapped into the gospel music tradition to give a new voice to a people struggling for their rights as first-class citizens. They borrowed the rhythms, musical structures, vocal and instrumental style, and emotional delivery of gospel music, transformed rhythm and blues into soul. I think that we had mentioned these three gentlemen because they probably had more influence on the different styles of music, and soul music had more influence on the different styles of music probably than any other genre that's alive and well today, including hip-hop. Most of the sampling that was done by hip-hop artists in the 90s, 80s and 90s and beyond came from songs of freedom, liberation, and protest formed in the soul music of the 70s. James Brown, Ray Charles, Sam Cooke, some of the other notable artists as Curtis Mayfield, Gladys Knight and the Pips, Temptations, Edwin Starr, Otis Redding, Al Green, Joe Tex, Percy Sledge, Aretha Franklin, staple singers, the list goes on and on. These were all considered purveyors of the soul sound. And they had probably the most notable impact on the music of today. And also had a most notable impact in terms of inspiring and motivating those involved in the civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s. So there we have a short but concise breakdown on how African American music and African American history are so deeply intertwined and had such a great impact on not only African American history, but on American history and world history. I thank you very much for your time. I thank you for coming out. And hopefully you'll gather something from my comments.
Hey, y'all, once again, show y'all love for Mr. Jonathan Black, the entertainment attorney.